Hello and welcome back to episode 2 of StatCats India versus 20th Century USA. In episode 1, I looked at GDP both at the absolute level and per person to tell us that India today is on a purchasing power parity basis, roughly equal to 1910 America. So India is about 115 years behind on an income basis. But income doesn't tell us everything. For example, people in 1910 didn't have washing machines or fridges, something that increases the amount of time that families have on their hands, and time is a wealth of its own kind. So where does India today compare with the US of the 20th century when it comes to household appliances and other useful things? Here we go! Before we actually get to the appliances themselves, let's look at electricity, the thing we use to power appliances. In the Modi government's first term, they made a big deal of achieving nearly 100% electrification of India. According to the National Family Health Survey number 5, by the way, they do this survey about once every 5 years. They had one right after the economy opened up in 1993, and then in 1999, then in 2006, then in 2016, and then in 2021, which is the most recent data we have for this survey. Pretty forkin' random years to do them if you ask me, but it's some data, which is always a blessing in India. There was a survey done in 2024 as well, but the results haven't been released yet, so I'm relying on data from 2021. According to the NFHS, the percentage of households living with electricity are, in urban areas, 99%, and in rural areas about 96%, making for an all-India average of about 97%. Having traveled loads in rural and urban India, it seems plausible, though I don't know if my personal feeler is that it's 97%. I can think of at least one of the 10 houses that I visited just on my most recent trip which didn't have electricity. To be fair, Meghalaya is the back of the beyond, and I'm not even sure the thing that I visited would be classified as a house or more like a temporary work shack. When the first of these surveys came out in 1993, the electrification percentage was about 50% of the population. This is because electrification had been steadily increasing through the 1900s under the socialist regime, and when the economy opened to capitalism in 1991, it was about half of the households in India which had access to electricity. Within 30 years, that number reached nearly 100%. The US, by contrast, had an electrification of nearly 100% by the 1950s. This had increased from less than 10% in 1900 to 50% in 1930 to nearly 100% by 1950. So despite technological improvements in the 21st century, India's electrification from 50 to 100% was much slower than the US equivalent. Why is that? Well, the US was already much richer per person at the start of its electrification journey than India is even today, let alone in the 1990s. At the start of the American electrification journey in 1900, the US had a per capita income of about $10,000, whereas India even today has it at only $3,000, let alone in 1993 when we were at $700 per year, adjusted for inflation. Alright, so in terms of electricity access, India is about roughly where 1950s USA is. In terms of electricity consumption, the average Indian today consumes about 1.5 megawatt hours a year. A megawatt hour is essentially using a megawatt for 1 hour. For context, 1.5 megawatts a year is about the electricity consumption of one fridge and maybe some light bulbs. Spoiler alert, lol. The average American today consumes about 13 megawatt hours a year, which is roughly 10 times as much as the average Indian. The last time US power consumption per person was in line with India's 1.5 megawatt hours was 1940, roughly. Fun little anecdote from my childhood. So I grew up in Dubai, but we used to spend at least a month, if not 2 months, if not 3 months in India every time we had summer holidays from school. Now, as a kid, I loved my PlayStation, and I was less of a pain in the ass to my parents if I had one, So they brought the PlayStation from Dubai to India with them every time we went. Now, I couldn't play a single game on that PlayStation in India because every time, back then it was the PlayStation 2, and you had to actually manually save at certain points in the game. But every few hours or so, we'd have what's known as a power cut. I'm not sure if, non-Indians are that familiar with this, but the electricity goes out. And most people didn't have generators back then. So, yeah, it goes out for like 2 hours, and we'd kind of just sit around twiddling our thumbs. If we were lucky, it was daylight, but often it was night. And the electricity would go out for the whole district. And that means no street lights, that means no lights in other people's houses. So it was pitch black. If you were in the house, it was pitch black. The only person who kind of knew where to go was my granddad, because it was his house. So as soon as the power went out, everybody froze in the pitch black darkness. And Granddad would go looking for a candle. It would usually take him about 5 minutes, but he knew the house so well by then. He'd been living in it for like 50 years. So he'd find the candle, and he'd light it, and he'd bring it to the dining table. And all of us would huddle around the dining table, and it kind of forced us to just have family conversations for a while. And I remember a few times the reason that the power went out is because there were monsoon rains. So yeah, it would be pitch black, middle of the night. We'd be huddled around a candle, maybe eating some snacks or something. But if you didn't have snacks on hand, you couldn't really easily cook unless you set up a flashlight or candle where your gas-powered stove was. So you just hang out and listen to the thunderous rain, and the actual thunder was kind of magical. I miss those days. Even if I was just praying for the power to come back so that I could play my video game, it was nice moments like that. The good old days where India didn't have electricity. Nowadays, it's a little bit different. We still have power cuts in India. It goes out usually once a day, twice a day, but only for 15-20 minutes at a time. Still means that if you're running on something which doesn't have its own battery or UPS system, it's going to go off and you're going to get interrupted. Like if you're watching TV, your show just goes off at a random point in the day. It's pretty annoying, to be honest. And for businesses, it's much worse because they can't run factory production lines unless they have a generator, or you can't have an little IT workshop, or a little digital workshop unless you have a generator and a UPS. It increases your costs as a business. But this is something that the country is working on. We're adding a lot of electricity every year, barely keeping up with the increased demand, but it's getting better. So yeah, fun stories from times in India. Alright, so now that we know about electricity consumption, how are people using their power? Let's start with refrigerators. Here's a note from IIR, the International Institute of Refrigeration. Quote, "Economically speaking, the importance of refrigeration is paramount. The number of refrigeration-related jobs is increasing in both developed and developing countries. Refrigeration is vital for reducing post-harvest and post-slaughtering losses and in the preservation of food products. As refrigeration maintains food safety, nutritional, and organoleptic qualities, it has become fundamental for the retail sector." End quote. I think they spell it out pretty well. Refrigeration has been a game changer for both people and for agriculture. You can just produce surplus stuff, and retailers and people shove it into their fridges, and it lasts way longer than it used to pre-refrigeration days. The IIR claims that about 17% of the electricity used globally is consumed by the refrigeration industry, which seems too high to me. Fridges are almost 1/6 of electricity consumption? If that's true, I gotta get a more efficient fridge to bring my bills down. India's refrigerator penetration today is about 45%. About 1 in 2 households has a fridge in India, though the stat varies a little bit based on where you look, as it's understandably hard to find a survey that gives us an accurate picture of fridge ownership across a country as diverse as India. The numbers between 35 and 60% so I'm going with a safe 45 for now. India's refrigerator penetration in 1990, when the economy first opened up, was something like 5%. By 2005, it increased to 14%. By 2016, it was about 30%, and now it's about 45%. In the span of 35 years between 1990 and today, India has gone from nearly zero ownership of fridges to about half of households. That is huge. And at that rate of growth, it looks like we'll reach close to 100% by the end of the decade. Let's look at the USA by comparison. To find when the USA was nearly at zero fridge penetration, we have to go back to 1920. Not because people couldn't afford it as much as that mass-produced fridges were only just becoming available at the time. The electric fridge was invented in 1913 and became mass-produced only in 1918, so by 1920 the penetration was nearly zero. I hope someone's keeping track of how many times I'll say penetration in this episode. In 1931, a study by Time Inc. found that 10% of American families had an electric refrigerator. So within those 10 years, not much happened, and by 1940 that number was already up to more than 50%. So India is roughly here in 1940s America in terms of fridge penetration. By 1960, refrigerator penetration in the USA was nearly 100%. So in terms of just the pure ownership percentage, India is at about 1940 with regards to the US. But in terms of growth of penetration, we are still doing worse than they did. Now in the US, it seems that the number went from nearly 0% in 1920 to about 100% in 40 years by 1960. So in this metric, the USA did double of what India did in terms of fridge quality of life for households, within nearly the same time frame. The reason being that in the USA the limiting factor wasn't income, but the invention and then mass production of the electric fridge. While India's fridge penetration is a process of incomes increasing, since fridges have already been invented and are mass produced and are way cheaper now than they were back then. In fact, fridges in 20th century America were much more expensive than how much they cost in India today. According to AEI.org, the average price of a fridge in the USA in 1940 was about $152, which when adjusted for inflation is $3,400 today. I browsed Amazon India to see how much a fridge costs today, and the range is something like lower end $200 to higher end $1,000 roughly. Which I would assume would give us an average fridge buying price in India today of the lower hundreds of dollars, which is 1/10 the cost of 1940 USA. I would expect fridge penetration to reach 100% soon, within a decade or two, for sure. So invest in your friendly fridge company in India now. Moving on to washing machines. Washing machines are also super important. According to economist Ha-Joon Chang, one of the most famous economists of our day, the washing machine is more important than even the internet in terms of productivity. He says the internet has only transformed the working lives of a small minority of people, whereas, quote, by liberating women from household work and helping to abolish professions such as domestic service, the washing machine and other household goods completely revolutionized the structure of society. As women have become active in the labor market, they have acquired a different status at home. They can credibly threaten their partners that if they don't treat them well, they will leave them and make an independent living. And this had huge economic consequences. Rather than spend their time washing clothes, women could go out and do more productive things. Basically, it has doubled the workforce. End quote. The message? Washing machines might be the most important invention in human history as far as social dynamics go. And anyone who's been to India knows that our society is still structured largely on domestic workers and women doing chores. Washing machine penetration in India is something like 20%, depending on which source you use. I can see why this one is low. It's not only that people can't afford washing machines, though that is a factor, it's also that most buildings in India have a local dhobi, a washing man or woman, or sometimes a whole family. You give them your clothes and they hand wash them using either their own washing machine or they wash them by hand. In most cities, dhobi services are remarkably cheap, costing only 100 rupees per kilogram. That's about $1. So on the one hand, it's insanely cheap to get your laundry washed and folded by someone else, so why wouldn't you? And secondly, that person relies on this service for their livelihood. And they would likely flood some other domestic service industry or be forced to return to the countryside farm if they didn't have this job. Both of which would be going economically backwards for them in the short term. So compared to a fridge where no one else can keep your food cool for you, and so penetration is already at 50%, washing machines aren't urgent in Indian society. In the US, the first electrically powered washing machines were mass-produced starting in the early 1900s. But these weren't automatic. They had to be intervened 2 or 3 times during the washing cycle. Then in World War II, production of washing machines was halted in favor of war manufacturing, and in the meantime, producers took the time to invent the fully automatic washing machine. So sales of these only pick up in the 1950s, which we can consider the starting point in the US, and by 1960, within 10 years, the US washing machine penetration was at about 40% of households. They were expensive too. A 1959 Sears washer cost $210, which inflation adjusted is $2,500 today. By contrast, you can get a washing machine in India today for about $200 in today's money, less than 1/10 of the cost. So India's washing machine penetration of 20% is roughly at about 1950 USA at the dawn of the automatic washing machine. The USA in 1975 more or less plateaued at 75% ownership, which is roughly where it is even today at 80% ownership. With this one, I'd imagine India to follow a similar growth path as the USA and take about 25 years from today to plateau penetration of washing machines, more or less. Though, because labor is so cheap in India and inequality is high, I would imagine the plateau of washing machines might be more like 50% in India, and then it'll increase very slowly from that point on. Alright, that's pretty much it for today's episode. I was going to compare air conditioning too, but the USA has too varied a climate to really compare air conditioning penetration to India. So in summary, India is roughly equivalent to 1950s USA in terms of electricity consumption and household appliances. And we can expect both electricity consumption and the appliance industry in India to grow by an order of magnitude in the coming decade or two. So make your investments wisely. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.